to Summoner's Rift. "30 seconds until minions spawn." Minions have spawned. First blood. An enemy has been slain. Enemy double kill. Your team has destroyed a turret. An enemy has been slain. Enemy rampage. An enemy has been slain. Shut down. Has been slain. An enemy is godlike. Your turret has been destroyed. summoner has disconnected. Reconnected. Has been slain. An enemy is unstoppable. An enemy has been slain. kill. An ally has been slain.
Oh, right. Today is Friday, July 22nd, and this is a recap for the stock market activities today. And folks, I got a good one for you tonight. It's a Friday night special, although by the time the video is out, it's probably going to be Saturday in the morning in most regions. But stop crying and complaining already and get it together, because you're going to need the complaining and crying in a minute. So save that for later on, because the macroeconomics discussion that we have tonight is a little bit scary. And by scary, I mean realistic. Anyhow, I'd like to start the show by addressing the critically important news that we got this week about the health of the President of the United States. Take a look.
And guess what? The first frost, you know what was happening. You had to put on your windshield wipers to get literally the oil slick off the window. That's why I and so damn many other people I grew up have cancer. And why can't, for the longest time, Delaware had the highest cancer rate in the nation.
Oh, I'm sorry, that was a gaffe when he just casually announced that he has cancer. But he actually has the thing. And while being a critic of the Biden administration, I wish him a speedy recovery. And I hope that he's going to feel better soon, get back on his feet, and kick on all cylinders. Not the pedals, though, because last time around, that did not end up pretty good. But why am I wishing President Biden a speedy recovery and talking nice about him? Well, maybe because he's the president, he's the captain of the ship, or maybe because the alternative is a lot scarier. Warning, if you have sensitive ears, you might want to turn the volume down a notch. Folks, because that's going to be hot business. The amount of ear damage the American people have to endure will be tremendous. Anyways, we covered a lot here, but we still have more. We haven't even started yet, so let's do that, and here it is, in focus tonight. A rude awakening. For who? The deniers. The people who continue to say that, oh, you're just exaggerating, you're being too negative, the economy's going to be fine. Look at the consumer. The consumer is so strong. Everybody's splurging and traveling and buying shit. How do you say that the economy's going to dip into a recession? You're in for a rude awakening. And I'm going to expose to you the whole myth of the strong consumer. Stick around. Let's start by talking about the booming economy that we all hear about. Booming economy. I actually call it the kabooming economy. For example, this week we got leading economic indicators pointing to a recession late this year. There you go. Here's your booming economy. Somehow leading economic indicators are collapsing in the so-called booming economy. On top of that, this week we got the Philly Fed Manufacturing Index. What a disaster that was. Look at this. Does this look to you as economic expansion ahead, or does it look like holy shit we're going down? Because last time we've seen this kind of dive down in the Philly Fed Manufacturing Index, it was prior to the great financial crisis and the crash in 2020. Back then, we had the Fed to the rescue. This time around, the Fed will be nowhere to be found because we have inflation and the Fed doesn't have the same amount of ammo. When we dig into the details of the Philly Fed Manufacturing Index, look at this. When we talk about new orders, only 12% of those answering the survey said that they're seeing increase in new orders versus almost 37% who said no increase. Actually, we saw a decrease in new orders. Meanwhile, a stunning majority, 55.6%, indicated the prices paid actually went higher month over month versus only 3.4% who said prices went down month over month. Likewise, when we talk about prices received, 36.5% say prices went higher month over month versus only 6.1% who say prices went down. What does that mean? You have new orders going down month over month while prices continue to move higher. We have stagflation in the economy. And next step will be a recession. If that was not enough, today we got absolutely stunning, unbelievable piece of data. The flash PMI was not just a miss, it was a miss by a lot. It now points to a deterioration of the U.S. economy. What are they talking about? Here's the commentary from Chris Williamson, the chief economist at S&P Global Market Intelligence. He says the preliminary PMI data for July point to a worrying deterioration in the economy. Excluding pandemic lockdown months, output is falling at a rate not seen since 2009. Da-da-da. Amid the global financial crisis, with the survey data indicative of GDP falling at an annualized rate of approximately 1%, manufacturing has stalled, and the services sector rebound from the pandemic has gone into reverse. As the tailwind of pent-up demand has been overcome by the rising cost of living, higher interest rates, and growing gloom about the economic outlook. An increased rate of order book deterioration, with backlogs of work dropping sharply in July, reflects an excess of operating capacity relative to demand growth and points out to output across both manufacturing and services being cut back further in coming months unless demand revives. What does that mean? We talked about this point numerous times in this channel. The geniuses who thought that the solution to this inflation is to ramp up the supply chain, they're now finding themselves into a massive deep hole because they responded to out-of-whack demand, unrealistic demand that was off the charts, fueled by stimmies and insane money printing. It was an unsustainable level of demand. The supply takes time till it hits the market, but it's now responding to demand that is not even here, a demand that is going down. So we're seeing problems such as in Target, for example, saying, hey, we have an excess of inventories right now, and the demand suddenly dropped. So our margins will go down because we have to eat a loss on that inventory. Continuing. However, with companies' expectations of future growth slumping to the lowest since the early days of the pandemic, any such revival is not being anticipated. Instead, firms are already reassessing their production of workforce needs, resulting in slower employment growth. Da-da-da. And here's Chris Williamson's attempt to put a lipstick on a pig. Although supply constraints remain problematic, constraining economic activity, the weakening demand environment has helped to alleviate inflationary pressures. Average prices charged for goods and services consequently rose at a much reduced rate in July. The rate of inflation still running high by historical standards, but now down to a 16-month low to provide some much-needed good news amid the ongoing cost of living crisis. Here's the problem. Is inflation going down for the good reasons or for the bad reasons? The guy just told you. Inflation is going down because demand is all of a sudden disappearing, meaning inflation is going down for the wrong reasons, for the recessionary force that is creeping into this economy. And when he talks about slower employment, it's not only that. We're also seeing higher unemployment in the economy. Unemployment is rising slowly but surely, higher, little by little by little. Are you going to see that surge of unemployment coming around the corner? Take a look.
Get right back over to Steve Leisman. He's got some economic data that just hit the wire. Steve, what are you seeing?
Jobless claims coming in more than expected, Becky, topping that 250 mark that now I guess raises some questions about the extent to which we have some real weakness in the job market. Now, this is going to be a test of the idea of all of these job openings. You can imagine, given what's happening in the economy right now, that there are some layoffs in one sector, and yet this idea that there is all of these unfilled jobs out there might suggest that over a very relatively quick period of time, these workers would be picked up and find jobs elsewhere. We don't know that, but you can imagine there could be a spike, and it wouldn't necessarily portend things going particularly bad in the job market, given the number of job openings, pardon me, and how tight it's been.
And of course, Steve Leisman is trying to put a lipstick on a pig, saying, hey, all of these people who are losing their jobs right now, they will find a job easily because we have more job openings than there are unemployed folks. We have 2 jobs for each unemployed. Here's my hunch. Sooner or later, we will find out that that number is a fugazi, the job openings number. Maybe the double counting or something funny is going on. Does anybody really believe that we have 2 jobs open for each unemployed person? Of course not. And it's about to get a lot worse. You better hope that Steve Leisman is right, because here's the shocking news that we got this week from Ford. Ford is preparing to cut as many as 8,000 jobs in the coming weeks as the automaker tries to boost profits to fund its push into the electric vehicle market. 2 things here. Number 1, their profits are down, the economy is deteriorating, and their margins absolutely suck. I used to be a shareholder of Ford, by the way, not anymore. The strategy's all over the place. Now, all of a sudden, they have to cut costs. The easiest way to do that is to fire employees. They're getting rid of over 8,000 employees. That is a massive number for one company. But another part contributing to this massive wave of layoffs in Ford is the EV lunacy, the insanity by the greenies of this rush into EVs. When they did that, it was absolutely misguided. They decided to phase out all of these assembly lines for combustion engines because they have targets. They have to get rid of all of these cars and go all in into EVs. So they shut down the factories to make them into EV factories. Okay, in the meantime, where's the supply? The consumer need cars. Where are they going to get cars? Oh, the EVs are coming. Here's the problem. With all of these companies all of a sudden rushing together to build EVs, what is that going to do? Supply shortages, mainly in EV batteries. We have a shortage of lithium, a shortage of nickel, cobalt, aluminum, zinc, copper, graphite, and the list goes on and on and on. Not because these resources are not ample on the planet, but because we have all of a sudden a massive shock increase in demand. All of these car manufacturers, American, European, Chinese, they all want to build EVs. Meanwhile, we haven't developed lithium mines or nickel mines enough to produce the resources needed for these batteries. And that resulted in lithium prices, all of these materials, to shoot up significantly higher. So we have 2 problems now due to the EV lunacy. Number 1, there was a shortage of new cars, and these EVs that they promised us, they're not even here. Number 2, because of the EV lunacy, the prices of EVs shot up significantly higher. The average right now sits at around $60,000, if not even more. The average household income is $60,000, if not less. How the hell are they going to afford these EVs? And the shortage of new cars in the market is causing used cars prices to move significantly higher, pushing inflation higher, and the consumer has no other choice but to buy a shitty used car, paying more for that car than what's new. But of course, your beloved politicians and leaders, they don't even care. This is part of their agenda. They want you to experience pain at the pump because, according to their genius plan, this will increase the demand in EVs. People will adopt EVs faster. You know, the prices magically will go down at some point, and this will save the planet. Take a look at your beloved Transportation Secretary, Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
On a different tack. I looked at the F-150 you said, both the electric and the gas-powered one, and there's a difference of about $20,000 between one and the other. And when you look at the $20,000, if you estimate about 20 miles a gallon, it's going to take about, at today's prices, it takes about 80,000 miles in order for you to break even. I'm not even talking about charging costs. I'm just talking no charging costs. And so if you actually put that down to about $2.50 a gallon, which was the price of gas before the Biden administration, that you don't break even until about 160,000 miles. Is the Biden administration actively pursuing high energy prices in order to force Americans into electric vehicles?
Of course not. And I also want to emphasize that you don't have to wait that 80,000 or 160,000 miles or however many it would be to break even if you don't pay for the vehicle in cash, right? The great thing about an auto loan is you can realize the savings in terms of less maintenance and less fuel, even while the initial car payment might be higher, right? And so you're coming out ahead right out of the gate instead of having to wait many years for a payback, unless of course you are buying the vehicle in cash.
No, you can. I mean, your finance costs are going to be depends if you lease it, et cetera. But the finance at the end of the day, you're going to be paying $20,000 more every cut at least. And that's actually if you finance, you're going to pay more because you're going to take interest, right? So at the end of the day, again, you're going to take either 80 at $5 a gallon, it's 80,000 miles to break even. And then, by the way, have you figured in the 10-year lifespan of the battery that you have? So if you have 100,
yes, we have. I mean, the estimates that are showing that this is reaching parity and pointing toward a savings, depending on the model, do account for things like that.
but you would agree that the higher the price of gas, then the faster you reach that parity.
Of course, the more pain we are all experiencing from the high price of gas, the more benefit there is for those who can access electric vehicles. That's why we're hoping you and your colleagues might reconsider opposing the reduction of EV upfront prices with tax credits.
So you're saying the more pain we have, the more benefit we're going to have. I think that's what I heard you say. I think you said the more pain we
No, that's what you heard.
No, that's what I heard you say.
I know you want me to say it so bad, but honestly, sir, what we're saying is that we could have no pain at all by making EVs cheaper for everybody, and we'd love to have your support on that.
EVs cheaper by subsidizing them, or
Yes, that's part of it.
yeah, but that doesn't make it cheaper. That means
Well, actually, it
somebody
does.
else
So you
is
have a
paying.
market
We're all paying for it
making,
at the end. We're all paying taxes.
but it makes it cheaper because that market making investment gets you past the tipping point. Current estimates actually are that the U.S., as we cross that 5% new sales level, is starting to hit what analysts typically consider to be that tipping point. But the more we stimulate the production of clean cars, right, the more you hit the economies of scale, it makes them cheaper to produce in the first place, which means that you won't need as many subsidies in the future. That's why we believe in this policy.
So he says, yes, EVs might be more expensive by about $20,000 over regular cars, but it's a lot cheaper in the long run if you lease them or finance them. The guy's an absolute moron, an absolute amateur, has absolutely no clue how economics work. The other point, the fact that he's so out of touch, you have to experience more pain, that's good for us. What are these lunatics planning to do? Because his sponsors, the oligarchs pushing the green energy/EV lunacy, they're rushing to do it so fast to save the planet, quote unquote. They have no problem flying these private jets that produce more emissions than we will ever do, regular folks, to fly a 17 minutes flight, a 20 minutes flight, a 45 minutes flight, because God forbid they ever have to drive. They're stuck in traffic with you, the bums, the subjects. God forbid they have to fly commercial with these people. I'll trust that these oligarchs really care about the planet once they start putting their money where their mouth is and fly commercial like the rest of us. But anyhow, the economic collapse is not just happening here in the US, it's happening across the globe. The global flash PMI is already in negative territory. That means a recession. Not just here, globally. The United Kingdom, for example, that economy is collapsing. It is one of the worst economies in the Western world right now. We'll look at different European economies, the Eurozone, France, Germany, all collapsing, dipping into negative territory, contraction territory. The manufacturing PMI. We'll look at different composite PMIs in France and Germany, services, manufacturing, all of them are dipping into negative territory. Is this an indicator for an upcoming boom in the economy or an upcoming disaster? On top of that, in Europe, it's not just that their economies are collapsing as they are right now. On top of that, there's a double whammy coming from the ECB because we have a massive stagflation phenomenon here. We have economies slowing down tremendously in a recessionary-like fashion, while inflation continues to stick higher, which means the ECB have to increase interest rates higher. And this week, they increased interest rates by half a point, the first time in 11 years. So you have two forces now crushing the European economy. The recession force, stagflation, then you have the ECB raising interest rates. And you think the crash and the collapse of the European economy is not going to have local impacts, the impact is here in the United States? Think again. But I know we're supposed to be immune, we're the best economy in the world, the strongest, the biggest, yada, yada, yada. The BlackRock administration top propagandist, Brian Deese, says we have a historic labor market right now. We also have household balance sheets that continue to be strong. These are not the marks of an economy in a recession. Brian Deese says, what recession? Like he said, what inflation before, right? Transitory inflation. Now he says, I don't see the recession. We have a strong consumer here. How could you say that they're in a recession? And let me expose to you the myth, the so-called strong consumer. Brian Deese says, household balance sheets are absolutely phenomenal. We're not going to have a recession here. You mean this phenomenon? Look at household savings rate, for example. Yes, it shot up higher during the pandemic, but now the savings rate is collapsing because inflation is eating away whatever savings households have. They have to spend more. Matter of fact, the personal savings rate in America just hit its lowest level since the Great Recession. Even as rates in saving accounts have risen. What good? What happens when the consumer is out of savings? They spent all of their savings, either on splurging in the economy and traveling or to cope with this inflation. The answer is ramping credit card users, swiping those credit cards up and down, up and down, up and down, with no end in sight. Here's the problem. While the consumer is resorting to use record highs amount of credit using these credit cards, buy now, pay later, whatever method they can find, interest rates are moving higher. So your credit card interest rates will surge significantly higher. All of that debt that consumers are racking up on their credit cards, that's going to cost more to pay down. Here's the problem. It's not just that interest rates are moving significantly higher. And by the way, the interest rate in credit cards, the average is around what, 18%, 20%? That's moving higher and higher by the day. It's not only that. What happens when the consumer racks up an insane amount of credit card debt, buy now, pay later, getting auto loans that they cannot really afford, getting mortgages that they cannot really afford, and then they lose their source of income, they lose their job because unemployment will move higher. This is exactly what the Fed wants to see in the economy because inflation will not go down without higher unemployment. unemployment. You're seeing it happening in Ford. It's going to happen in many other companies. What happens if these consumers lose their jobs? How are they going to pay that debt back? Applications for U.S. state unemployment insurance rose for a third week to the highest since November, as more companies announced job cuts, suggesting some softening in an otherwise solid labor market. And by the way, when they say solid labor market, they're referring to job openings, which by now you should realize that's a fake number. But again, what happens when the consumer lose their job and they have all that debt to finance? Here comes what? Here comes car repos. We talked about that. You're not going to be able to afford your car. We talked about Lucky Lopez a few videos ago. How consumers making $2,500 a month taking car loans that amount to more than half their monthly salary. Absolute insanity, risk-taking that we've never seen before in the auto market. On top of that, what happens to your mortgage when you lose your job? You can't pay that anymore. And we are already seeing banks reporting rise in mortgage delinquencies. This is the strong consumer right here. When the media says, oh, this time around the housing market's not going to see any collapse, like we've seen back in 06 or 9, because the average credit score is much higher. The credit score means nothing. It's all about whether you have a source of income or not. A lot of folks assume that their wages will be permanent. If they took mortgages they cannot really afford. What happens when they lose their jobs? Those are, you know, on top of that, we got an absolutely stunning addition this week by AT&T CEO.
We did the hard things we did in restructuring the business last year to give us the latitude and flexibility to do these types of things. And, you know, then we've also seen a little bit of working capital issues as we move through it. There's clearly some dynamics going on in the economy where we have customers that are stretching out their payments a bit. We expect that they're going to continue to pay their bills, but they're taking longer to do it. That's not atypical in an economic cycle, and we're starting to see maybe the bottom end of the subscriber base making some decisions between, you know, am I paying this bill this month or that bill this month, given some of the pressures they're seeing at home.
So now we have consumers who cannot even pay their phone bill. Is this what the strong consumer looks like? When consumers are now behind in their bills because they have to pay more at the gas pump, the grocery store, or the rent. That's a major story. Nobody's paying attention to it right now. Rents out of control. And oh, by the way, paying other utility bills that are out of control. And soon enough, you have to pay back your student loans. Uncle Joe's not going to cancel your student debts. The freezing of paying your student debt. Well, Uncle Joe cannot even save himself, let alone save you. You're going to have to pay that back again. What happens when people start to lose their jobs? This is the question that every person in news media right now, financial news media, the Fed, all of these pumpers and banks, and so-called analysts and economists have to bring out. What happens when consumers start to lose their jobs? You think they're going to buy iPhones and Teslas and splurge in the economy? Of course not. So what happens to these companies? What happens to the stocks of these companies? But I know what you're going to say. But Maverick, I don't believe what you're saying right here. Because all I see when I go out is people splurging, dining out, traveling all over the place. Look at American Express, for example. The company reported earnings today, and here it is. Amex saw spending on its network soar as customers continue to take to the skies despite mass cancellations and long waits at the airports, lending the firm to raise its forecast for full-year revenue. In other words, people are using their credit cards, they're splurging, traveling the economy. What are you talking about here, Maverick? Another one. The headline reads, inflation. Consumers spend 40% of monthly food budgets in restaurants. Is this the recession, Maverick? What are you talking about? Or are you just firm up here? Here's what's going on in the economy, folks. I talked about this before in details. The recession is creeping its way high. The income hurt, hitting the poor, the lower middle class first, hitting the middle class, the higher middle class, and the rich, and then finally the oligarchs when the economy collapses. What's going on in the economy right now? We have a recession in the poor and lower middle class. Why? Because they're paying more in rents, they're paying more at the gas pump, they're paying more at the grocery store, they're paying more in utility bills. They cannot splurge in the economy anymore. They can barely hold on. They are in a recession right now. They have no idea whether they're going to be able to pay rent or not. What's going to happen when they max their credit cards? For example, we got a warning from a company that caters to this demographic, Ross stores, even though I shop at Ross sometimes because I like a bargain. But Ross came out and said that they're seeing demand collapsing all of a sudden. They're finding themselves with excess inventory, the same problem that we heard from Target, for example. And that demand suddenly disappeared because the consumer is facing a recession-like environment. We're talking about the poor and the lower middle class. Now, the mid class is facing stagflation. They have to cut down spending in certain areas because inflation is too high. So they have to budget and move things around. But they still have their jobs. Yes, they're paying more, but they're not spending more in the economy as they used to. Hence, they're not stimulating the economy. For now, the middle class is facing a stagflation phenomenon. Lower economic activities, lower spending in the economy, but prices inflation remains too high. Then you have the higher middle class. They're still facing inflation, but they're not facing a stagflation phenomenon right now for the most part, meaning they're not trimming down their spending to cope with inflation. Even though we have warning signs from stores such as Restoration Hardware, who came out and said the demand is moving down, and therefore the stock of RH went down big. But for now, think of the high middle class as, yeah, prices are high, it's inconvenient, they have to pay more, but it's not really lowering their standard of living or forcing them to make drastic changes in their behavior, specifically spending behavior. You see all of these spoiled brats, the 20-something crowd, or hopping from one concert to the other, one music festival to the other, paying insane amounts for these tickets. Who do you think funding all of that? The answer is daddy's credit card. What happens when the Fed increases interest rates higher and daddy has to pay more? Well, daddy's not going to be happy. Daddy's going to say, you got to cut down, ease it down. My stock portfolio's down. I'm losing money here. Maybe you should tone it down a little bit. And that's how it becomes a stagflation phenomenon. And then the next step would be recession. But surely, recession moves its way higher. Then you got the rich. The same with the high middle class, who have tech jobs and are secure from that. The rich relies on what? Relies on stocks, real estate valuations. These are not down enough, specifically real estate. So yes, they might be facing inflation for now, paying more for goods and services, but inflation kind of helps them out too, because they charge more for rent. This is the owner class. They're not going to be immune when the recession moves its way higher. And lastly, you got the oligarchs. oligarchs, the 1%, the Bezos, the Musks of the world, they're enjoying an economic boom. It's never been this good before. And when the recession hits them, when the crash happens, real estate valuations crash, stocks crash, everything crashes, we get to bail them out because they're too big to fail. So for them, it's always an economic boom. Why? Because we have an economic system that we think of as capitalism, but in reality, it is an oligarchy. Now, here's a few stories that illustrates for you what I just said. We talked about the affluent consumer spending 40% on restaurants. We talked about them using Amex cards, hopping from one music festival to the other with daddy's credit card. But what about the poor and the lower middle class who are already in a recession? And they're looking up and they're saying, hey, middle class, higher middle class, rich, you better watch out. What we're facing right now is about to hit you too. The headline reads, after inflation, people making the U.S. minimum wage are earning less now than 60 years ago. The standard of living has never been worse. For most people, most of them were not alive back in 60 years ago. Another one. The headline reads, inflation, consumers are reacting to high food prices, say grocer. What are they talking about? This is a small grocery store owner. He says, we're not Walmart. In turn, his purchasing manager pushed back against higher prices from suppliers. We advocate for our customers. Say Davidson, this is the guy. We're not Walmart, we're not Target, he said, but when someone calls and says, hey, I'm going to raise your costs 20% to cover my commodity piece, my comment back to that supplier is, hey, if we put that retail in your product, it will sit there and no one is going to buy it. The consumer cannot afford it. Another one. The headline reads, swelling grocery bills are plummeting the poorest, who spend over a quarter of their incomes on food. An estimated 38 million Americans are food insecure, meaning that they have insufficient means to obtain sufficient food. The concern is, with food inflation rising at the rate it is, more families will face the prospect of being unsure where their next meal is coming from. Wow, this is in the richest country in the world, folks. Why? Because look at this. A loaf of bread now costs $10. We're talking about bread here. You go ahead and look back in history. What happens when people cannot afford bread? A loaf of bread. What happens under these conditions? We talk about unrest. We talk about riots, revolutions, wars. But you got Marie Antoinette, the transportation secretary, saying, hey, this is actually good because it will force you to buy an EV that you cannot even afford. Here it is, folks. Next time you hear somebody saying, oh, it's a strong consumer, how could you say that we're in a recession? Now you know how to explain that. It's coming. It's hitting the poor, the lower middle class right now. It's going to creep its way little by little higher to the middle class, to the upper middle class, to the rich, to the oligarchs, and it's going to hit the entire economy. And guess how they're going to fix it? More trickle down. Let's bail out the oligarchs, the companies, and cause they create jobs. You see the rigged system that we have. Anyhow, the rant is over now. Let's move on to cover the stock market information for you. I'm going to start with the closing of the indices today, and here we go. The Dow Industrial Average closed down by 137.61 points, or a loss of 0.43%. The Nasdaq down in the red, losing 225.5 points, or a decline of 1.87%. The S&P 500 also down by 27.32 points, or a decline of 0.93%. What about the sectors' performances today? Coming up number one, capturing the gold, the silver, and the bronze. Utilities. Don't count utilities dead, at least not for now. The rest, we have consumer defensives and real estate in the green barely, so we're not going to give medals there. But the laggards of the day led by communication services, the obvious Snapchat, Rackdown, Meta, and Google. But we also have technology and cyclicals. So today was a defensive theme opposite to the main theme for the week, which was offensive. Here it is, the contrast, the performance for the week. Coming up number one, capturing the gold medal, cyclicals. Number two, the silver, green plus beers. Number three for the bronze, technology. Meanwhile, the laggards for the week, well, pretty much every sector was in the green, with the exception of communication services. The majority of the losses came today due to the obvious Snapchat, Meta, Google, and Google. And what about the advance to decline ratios? NYSE, 30% advancing versus 66% decline. NASDAQ, 22% advancing versus 73% decline. All for breadth for the last day of the week. Commodities, what's going on here? Mixed picture in food. We have the WTI down a little over 1.12%. Then we have Brent, food today, about 2 minutes for the feed closing slightly negative. And then we have the RBOB, gasoline, gained a little over 2.4% today. On the other hand, Heligo down by about 3%. Here it is, the party boy, natural gas, gaining about 5% for the day. Natural gas is climbing higher rapidly. This is going to be a major problem for the Fed because it pushes inflation higher. Now let's cover some energy news. The headwind that we have for natural gas is the Freeport LNG facility. It acts as a headwind or a tailwind, depends on the good news or the bad news. Good news from Freeport LNG means bad news for natural gas prices. Bad news from the Freeport LNG facility means good news for natural gas prices. Well, this week we got some good news from Freeport LNG. The headline reads, small amounts of natural gas flowing to Freeport LNG plant in Texas. The company has long said it does not expect the plant to return to partial service until October, but was not immediately available to explain the small amount of feed gas going to the plant. So we have a mystery here. What's going on? Are they testing by a little bit? Once that news came out, natural gas went down. That was on Thursday, and then it rebounded higher today because we continue to have supply problems over in Europe. Russia's playing games, Putin is playing games. He says that the flow of gas from Nord Stream 1 to Germany is back in order, but with conditions. Now, do we know whether the Germans agreed to these conditions or not? Well, we have no idea, which means the restart flows to Nord Stream 1 should not be taken for granted, at least for now. Then Putin comes out and says we're yet to see the quality of returned Nord Stream 1 equipment for Canada. So all of a sudden now it's about the quality of the equipment. We have to wait and see. This is all done to inflict more pain in Germany. In the meantime, Europe is ready to outbid the rest of the world for natural gas in the race to secure the winter supply. So Europe is willing to pay top dollar here. Where is the supplier, you might ask? Well, it's not going to be Russia. They cannot do it from Algeria, or Egypt, or Qatar. That's not an option, at least not for now. So the answer is U.S. LNG. Therefore, we're seeing natural gas futures here in the U.S. shooting up higher again, which means these natural gas stocks will be hot again. We're talking about Coterra, we're talking about EOG, we're talking about EQT, Cheniere. We have a lot of names here that will continue to gain because this story is not over yet. Back to the futures, what about stocks, we have declines, big ones, led by lumber. Lumber was down over 6% today, now trading at the 500s. We also have declines, big ones for coffee, losing over 4.5% today. Likewise, sugar is not acting sweet. It is down over 2.5% today. Then we have modest declines for cocoa and cotton futures under 1%. Meanwhile, OJ futures were flattish for the day. Metals, mixed picture. We have gains for gold, but declines for silver. I don't know what to make of that, but we have gains for platinum, copper, and palladium. Palladium shot up higher by more than 8% today. The dollar is down. This should be good for gold and metals in general, but the question is, how sustainable is the drop in the US dollar? Because if the dollar rebounds higher again, we will see gold, silver, copper all moving down again. What about meats? We have massive gains for both live and feeder cattle futures. Feeder cattle futures adding gains of almost 2% today. These two are still winners year to date. Then we have lean hogs. Lean hogs also gained about 1.5% today, but what you see here, it says down over 17%. That's wrong. We're actually updating the contract from the August contract, which was trading around $117, to the October contract, which is at around $96. So we're just updating the contract. It's not because lean hogs futures crashed overnight. Then we have grains. What's going on here? We have a decent rebound in soybean oil futures, gaining a little over 2.75% today. Likewise, a rebound in soybeans futures, gaining a little over half a percentage point today. We have canola closing in the green, with gains of almost 1%. On the other hand, we have declines for soybean meal, North rice futures, all declining modestly, but we have big declines. Corn, for example, is down over 2.25% today, but the story comes from oats and wheat. Oats down by almost 8% today, along with wheat, which was down over 6% today. And the question is the inflation of wheat over? The answer is perhaps because wheat futures are trading below the pre-war levels. And the good news that we got today, good news, by the way, means bad news for wheat futures, but good news is we have a peace between Russia and Ukraine to allow exports of grains to get out of ports. So it's good news, it pushed wheat and oats futures down. Not so much for corn, and it doesn't really solve the problem in the long run. Meaning if this war prolongs, we're still going to have a shortage of wheat, even as is for this season. Ukrainian farmers did not produce enough wheat. A lot of the farmland is damaged. A lot of farmers did not seed for the next season. We're still going to have a shortage of wheat. This will put a floor to the crop of wheat. Meaning we're going to see futures rebounding in those days. Now, wheat futures react to this piece of good news. Moving on to the options market, the big casino, what's going on here? The volume went higher significantly, but they're not buying a lot of calls. The put-to-call ratio remains kind of split in the middle. We're actually seeing a lot of folks buying puts, betting against the rebound. Regardless, at number one, the hottest table in the casino today was Tesla, the souffle, at around 2.2 million contracts traded today. About 55.5% of those were calls. At number two, Snapchat, around 1.2 million contracts traded for the name. About 58% of those were calls. At number three, Apple, at around 1.2 million contracts traded today. About 52% of those were calls. What about the unusual activities that took place in the options market today? We start with the ticker SNAP, Snapchat. Somebody's betting for a rebound here. They bought the $11 calls, expiration date, August 19th, with expectations. Despite the fact that the name is down over 38% today, we will see a rebound of over 11% by the expiration date of August 19th. They paid around 55 cents a piece to enter. This trade, all in all, spending around $770,000. Then, what about the trade from the ticker COOP for Mr. Cooper? This is a real estate company, single-family homes. They handle mortgages and all of that. Somebody's making a big bet here, betting against the name. Now, this is an unusual name. We don't see it often here, meaning this is perhaps an insider who probably knows something that we don't know. They bet against the name by buying the 36 puts with expiration date August 19th, with expectations the name to move down, losing more than 11% by then. They around $1.20 a piece. What about the trade to ticker GME, GameStop? The name split today. They could not wait for it to split organically. They split the name, and guess what? GameStop was down big today. But somebody's betting for a rebound here. They bought the $40 calls with expiration date July 29th, meaning next Friday. With expectations, the name could rebound higher and gain more than 12% by then. They paid around 75 cents a piece to enter this trade. All in all, spending around $675,000. And lastly, we have the ticker SNOW, Snowflake. Somebody's making a major bet here against the name. They bought the 130 puts with expiration date September 16th. With expectations, the name could move down by more than 9% by then. They paid around $11 a piece to enter this trade. All in all, spending around $10 million. Moving on to the heat map analysis, what's going on here? We're seeing the opposite picture for the week. Throughout the week, they've been buying the risk-on kind of stocks: technology, chips, software, cyclicals, communication services, biotech, and they've been dumping the ultra-defensives in utilities, REITs, big pharma, consumer staples. Today, we're seeing the opposite. They went back to the defensives, at least for now. For today, we saw big pharma outperforming, we saw utilities outperforming by a lot, and keep your eyes on utilities, specifically the XLU, because the dips in that name will be opportunities to buy. Maybe not right away. We have the summer rally. The summer rally will be led by tech and the risk-on kind of stocks. We will see utilities being dumped. However, it's not if, but when we go back to risk-off, we're going to buy utilities once again. Along with utilities, we've got real estate also outperforming, along with consumer defensive, consumer brands, mostly in the green, led by Procter & Gamble, gaining over 1.5% today. On the other hand, the losers, led by big cap technology stocks, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon, a different story because they got earnings of a short/gamma squeeze. The software was down today, chips were down, Nvidia lost over 4% today, banks were down, biotech was down. Today was defensive nature. Now let's contrast this to the weekly theme. Here it is. Big pharma down, all down, utilities muted, real estate lagging, consumer staples down for the week. What's working? Big caps, exception of Google, of course, because Google lost a lot today. Microsoft, Amazon, Tesla, software, chips, all gained significantly for the week. The reopening names, casinos, airlines, cruises, hotels, all winners for the week. Even in industrials, materials, and energy, the inflationary/commodity trade was hot. But even within industrials, look at the winner.
has been slain. An ally has been slain.
interest rates are on the rise, the stock market has had its worst first 6 months in over half a century, prices for everyday goods are remaining stubbornly high, and government support programs designed to help people through the pandemic are getting cancelled faster than sitcoms from the 1980s. A lot of people are in a more precarious financial situation now than they were at the supposed height of the pandemic. Just American spending on economic stimulus efforts adjusted for inflation is the same as America spent fighting World War II. Government budgets are very different from household budgets. So, while a lot of the typical sound bites about debt and fiscal responsibility might be a bit overblown, it's also important to remember that governments aren't magic. They can't just create value out of thin air to brush away any problems we face. If they could, we would live in a post-scarcity utopia, but obviously we don't. So, if governments don't manage their money like you or I, then how do they pay the bill for living above their means? The answer to this question can teach us a lot about what the next few months have in store for us. The standard thinking now is that we are stuck between unreasonably high inflation and a recession. Neither of these options are good, but they are bad in different ways, and they are bad for different people. So, how long will it take our economies to go back to normal? Who is really going to end up paying for the record spending done over the past 28 months? And are we stuck choosing between inflation and a recession, or is there another option? This episode of Economics Explained was brought to you by Public.com, the internet's premier platform for better investors. We all know we should have a diversified portfolio, but it's easier said than done. Holding multiple investments in multiple different asset classes used to mean having multiple brokers and spending a lot of money. But Public makes it easy with a range of public. Now you can decide to choose between unreasonably high inflation and a recession. Well, no, but that's not the good news you might think it is. The US currently has an annualized inflation rate of 8.6%, which is 3 to 4 times the Fed's target rate, and is very securely in what we would call unreasonable territory. Growth itself has also been very weak, with a negative first quarter and most predictions forecasting another slow quarter of growth having just passed. The technical definition of a recession is 2 quarters of negative real GDP growth. Now, most institutions these days no longer use that rigid framework for determining if we are or are not in a recession, but at least by the most solid definition that we have available, we are probably already there in most economies around the world. So yeah, there is another option besides picking high inflation or a recession. It's just not the option that you might have been hoping for, because it's C, all of the above. This is what economists call stagflation, and you'll probably start to hear this term thrown around more and more in the coming weeks and months. Stagflation was a term first used in the 70s to describe a period of low economic growth with high unemployment, which still manages to also have high inflation. Typically, low growth and high unemployment reduce inflation because if people don't have jobs and they are uncertain about the future, they won't spend as much money. If people don't spend as much money, there is less total demand in the economy, and if there is less demand, then prices fall. Lower prices are the exact opposite of inflation. We looked at this last month in our video on the recession that we need to have, so I don't want to repeat too much here, but stagflation is normally a sign that something has gone terribly wrong in the economy. It's like somehow dying of dehydration and drowning at the same time, and chances are it's something that we're going to have to deal with. The question is really becoming, how bad are both of these going to get? And to answer this question, let's start with inflation. Inflation is high right now for 2 reasons. There has been a lot of money injected into the economy in the past 2 years, and there have been severe product shortages caused by supply issues stemming from pandemic lockdowns, trade tensions, and now a war in Eastern Europe. Both of these will increase the prices of goods, but it's difficult to say which is having a bigger impact at any given time. Up until recently, the Federal Reserve Bank was primarily pointing the finger at supply chain issues for price spikes in certain areas. Conveniently, this would relieve them of responsibility for inflation because they only have direct control over cash flows in the economy. The Fed doesn't involve itself in trade negotiations or lockdown policies. This stance has been walked back by the Fed, and their research now indicates that approximately 3% of the current inflation rate was caused by income transfers, which is just a technical way of saying all the extra money that was pumped into the economy during the pandemic. Now, 3% is actually not that bad, and the Fed itself also quickly points out that had these measures not been taken, we would likely be experiencing deflation, which would have been worse for a variety of reasons. If the target rate of inflation is 2 to 3%, and we are currently at 8.5%, then the 3% caused by stimulus efforts represents half of the problem. Of course, the actual calculations are far more complex than this, and the Fed themselves have admitted that this 3% figure is likely to be adjusted upwards, but for now it gives us a pretty good benchmark to work with. So then, what is causing the other 3% of above average inflation that we are currently experiencing? Supply chain issues are certainly part of it. There is no getting around the fact that the way that we do business and add value in our economies has fundamentally changed in the past 2.5 years. But why are we only really experiencing this now? Industrial output has actually recovered to all-time highs in the US, and imports have spiked to make up for the supply shortages, and then some. A few months ago, supply chains were a major part of the inflationary problem, but now there's a little bit more to it. Of course, there are still certain items like consumer electronics, foodstuffs, and of course, oil that remain problematic, and a lot of these have had knock-on effects. Almost everything that we consume these days is transported hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers around the world before it gets to us. If oil is expensive, then this transport costs more money, a cost which will sooner or later be passed along to us as consumers. If we follow this line of thinking, we can start to find the real source of this additional 3%. Paul Donovan, the chief economist at UBS Global Wealth Management, astutely pointed out in a recent interview that only about 15 to 20% of what we spend on food is actually going to the food. The other 80% is being spent on the process of getting that food from the farm to our supermarkets. This is roughly made up of transport expenses, like the fuel that we were talking about earlier, and stuff like packaging and processing, which with COVID restrictions has become slightly less efficient. There is still two other big expenses that we need to account for when we buy our food, though, and that is the profit margins of all of the companies involved in the supply chains and the salaries of all of the workers that made it possible. All of this talk of inflation has been a golden opportunity for companies to raise their prices under the guise of simply keeping up with inflation. In reality, most companies have raised their prices too far, either out of fear of inflation persisting or, more realistically, because they can. If people are expecting a rise in the price level of their goods and services, they are not going to be surprised when there is a rise in the price level of their goods and services. The last 6 months have seen record corporate profits, despite a lot of fiscal stimulus measures being slowly tapered off, because these companies can now get away with charging whatever they really want to. Now, the biggest slice of this end good expense pie is almost always going to be labour costs, and those two are on the rise. Unemployment is very low at the moment, and less people are choosing to work at all. This means workers have more negotiating power to demand higher wages, and with all the talk of inflation, the motivation to do it as well. Going into your boss's office and telling them that you want to raise because in this labour market you're going to be very hard to replace probably won't go over very well. Telling them that you want to raise to keep up with inflation is much more reasonable. If everyone does this, it's very easy to see how we end up with higher prices on the goods that we end up buying off the shelf. So, can we fix this? Well, yes, actually. Higher interest rates will put a damper on business and consumer activity, which will make those businesses and workers less confident asking for record profits and salary increases. Actually, one of the most powerful tools the government has to fight this type of inflation is their rhetoric. By saying very loudly and very firmly that inflation has now become their #1 priority, we will start to expect that this issue won't last long, and in doing so, we'll be less motivated to take actions that lead to inflation in the first place. Of course, they still need to be very careful about this because the Fed may very well still have to reverse course very quickly if the economy falls into a recession. Doing the opposite of what they promised will mean that people won't listen to them anymore, which could strip them of this very underappreciated tool. We are actually seeing this at the moment here in Australia. The chairman of our Reserve Bank at the height of the pandemic said that they would not raise interest rates until 2024. He said this to try and calm consumers during a time when a recession was the biggest fear on people's minds. But now, after 3 record rate increases, people aren't going to take what he says very seriously anymore. Alright then, what about the recession? Inflation may very well be like Tinkerbell in that it only exists if people really believe it exists, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem. Most of the things that the government and reserve banks around the world do to fix inflation is exactly the opposite of what they do to fix a recession. If an economy has inflation that is too high, the central bank raises interest rates and the government taxes more while spending less. If an economy is going into recession, the central bank lowers interest rates and the government taxes less while spending more. So, what's the correct course of action when inflation is high and the economy is still headed towards a recession? The answer is really some kind of compromise. The Federal Reserve Bank's core mandate is price stability, and while they normally try to balance this with enabling economic growth, if they are backed into a corner, they will choose to maintain price levels even if it comes at the expense of pushing the economy into a recession. It sounds kind of heartless, especially when you remember that these actions will have real impacts on millions of regular people around the world, but that's just their role. It's possible to recover from even very severe recessions. It's much harder to recover from hyperinflation. We are already seeing this play out. At a time like this, with all of the problems in the world, the Fed would never consider raising interest rates, but because of inflation, they're doing it anyway. The response of the government is going to be a bit different though, because unlike the Fed, they don't have a narrow mandate, and instead they exist for the good of the people that they represent. The White House has already announced that inflation has become its top economic priority, and that it will not interfere with the Federal Reserve's efforts to cool inflation, even though it acknowledges that it could put a damper on the economy's recovery. Instead, the government is trying to roll out new stimulus measures to alleviate the effects of both inflation and the potential recession. But hang on, isn't huge government stimulus efforts half of the reason that we have the inflation problem to begin with? Well, yes, it is. But the difference with these new stimulus measures is that they are designed to increase the supply of goods and services in the economy rather than just the demand for goods and services. If you give a person a $1,400 check, that doesn't necessarily add value to the economy. Sure, they can go out and spend it to keep businesses going, but if you do this enough, you're just going to have an inflation problem. Instead, this new stimulus proposal is targeted at building out infrastructure, releasing oil reserves, and building more housing, all of which will increase the supply of goods and services in the economy, which should hopefully both take the rising prices, but also provide a certain level of economic stimulus at the same time. Unfortunately, we are stuck between a recession and inflation. The question is now, how bad is it going to be? I like to end things on a positive note, so the answer is that it might not actually be as bad as we have been led to believe. Doom and gloom articles get clicks, and as a person whose livelihood depends on how many people I can get to watch my videos, I know that bad news sells a lot better than good news. But I am personally not nearly as worried as I was 6 months ago. Reserve banks have acknowledged the inflation problem, and while they have waited a bit too long, they are now taking decisive steps to alleviate the issue. Employment is still strong, which means that at least people still have incomes. Yes, the stock market is having a very bad year, but that might be a blessing in disguise. Most of the value lost in the headline indexes has come from tech companies that were arguably wildly overvalued. A low interest rate environment meant that people could gamble on what companies would change the world in the decades to come, rather than investing in good old-fashioned businesses that were producing value now. The fall in the value of these tech companies is most of what has pulled the value of the total stock market down. Many of the biggest, more traditional companies in the world are actually having a great year. The same decline is likely to be seen in house prices as well, because these two asset classes are pretty strongly correlated. But again, that's not necessarily a bad thing for the broader economy. The biggest economic downturns in history more or less came as a complete shock. 1929, 1937, 2001, and of course 2008. This is not an excuse to get complacent, but the fact that we have been seeing this coming for years now means that we are less likely to be blindsided by the impacts of either inflation or a severe recession. This episode of Economics Explained was brought to you by Public.com.
been slain. An ally has been slain. Rampage. An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain. Enemy double kill. An ally has been slain. Enemy double kill. Shut down. Enemy double kill. Your turret has been destroyed. Shut down. He is godlike. An ally has been slain. Slain. An enemy is legendary. Enemy double kill. Your turret has been destroyed.
Hi friends, my name is Tris, and this is No Boilerplate, focusing on fast, technical videos. I'm going to talk to you about two features of Rust that no other popular language has. It's these two features that make Rust both as low-level as C and as high-level as Lisp, whereas most other popular languages are stuck somewhere in the middle. These two superpowers are Rust's macros and the unsafe system. There are high, mid, and low-level languages. Macros give you access to high-level language features. This category of techniques has a lot of different names: metaprogramming, templating, macros, or preprocessors. I'm going to call them build tools, because many languages have incomplete metaprogramming implementations that provide a very narrow set of features that I don't want you to mix up. Whereas in Rust, the macro system is so powerful you can create your entire build tooling using it, inside the compiler. Python's metaprogramming allows classes to build classes. Rust's metaprogramming is Turing complete and can do anything, including accessing the disk and network. Conversely, down at the low level, the unsafe system allows you the direct hardware access that every programming language uses, but only a few privileged C developers, i.e. the ones who first wrote the language, can use directly. In both high and low level, other languages say, "Here is the line, you may never cross it." Rust says, "Cross here if you know what you're doing." Let's talk about the unsafe system first. In most languages you have a floor to your abstraction that you can't get lower than without throwing away the language itself. These JavaScript and Python functions are actually written in C, and you'll be writing your own C code if you want to tweak them. This is how high-level languages are typically written. Even Go, a language that is often compared to Rust, is written partly in C++ and assembly. Fundamental functions and language features previously have only been written in C. High-level developer ergonomics and low-level hardware control are thought of as mutually exclusive. They perhaps were, until now. Rust guarantees that you don't need to worry about memory management. The compiler will help you as long as you obey the rules that I outlined in my last video. You may have heard the buzzword that linked lists are impossible to make in Rust. This is not true. The confusion arises because they're only impossible in safe Rust, which is where we, as application developers, spend all our time. If you want to make a linked list, as they did here in the standard library, you first step down into unsafe Rust, where you promise the compiler that you know what you are doing. Then, in your safe code, you can now use the safe abstraction you have just built. This is analogous to writing C extensions for Python or Ruby, or writing JNI to access native libraries in Java. You're promising that you've checked the safety of the code. If you write a C Python extension, you must throw out all of Python's ergonomics and safety and learn a whole new language with vastly different rules and constraints. In Rust, you need learn hardly anything more to write code in an unsafe block. Unsafe operations are those that can potentially violate the memory safety guarantees of Rust's static semantics. This list of language-level features cannot be used in the safe subset of Rust. Have you noticed the one thing that links all the items in this list of things you can only do in unsafe Rust? Unsafe operations are for framework authors. You and I, as web developers or game developers or application developers, will certainly never write unsafe code in our normal work, just as we never did before. However, the frameworks we use, the crates and third-party Rust libraries, will be faster, more powerful, and more importantly, be pure Rust with no C dependencies because of the unsafe system. The unsafe block is a brilliant feature that keeps us writing Rust when other programming languages would have to reach for C. The language designers incorporated it to avoid the unsafety of C. I like it because I don't have to learn any more languages. On to part 2, macros. Let's talk about the rep wrap. To build a rep wrap, you first build your own bad 3D printer with homemade parts and plans from the internet. Then you use that printer to print a better printer. This is like using macros. With other programming languages, you adapt the problem to the language. With Rust, you also can adapt the language to the problem. This sounds terrifying in traditional languages. Even with metaprogramming happy languages like Python and Ruby, where you can overwrite the addition operator and write DSLs, it's considered bad form and confusing for the next person. Macros are Rust code that do two things. 1, they run at compile time, and 2, they can modify your source code. These two properties allow you to do incredible magic that isn't possible in nearly all other languages. Lisp's being the big exception. Let's talk about running at compile time first. Macros are clearly notated in Rust by the exclamation or bang at the end of the name. The compiler enforces this convention, of course. This tells you, the developer, that some compile time execution is going to happen. This is in contrast to Python or Ruby, where it is not obvious what is happening. In this case, the query macro from the excellent SQLX library runs that SQL query on your local dev database at compile time in a rolled back transaction. The macro doesn't know what the value of organization will be. It will only be populated at runtime, perhaps on your production server or your customer's computer. However, thanks to the rich type system, the macro does know exactly what kind of value it will be. If it's a number, it knows the upper and lower bounds of that number. If it's a string, it knows its valid UTF-8, and so on. Because of this, the macro can generate a valid organization at compile time, probably random data, and feed that into the database's transaction to test a real query. If there is an error, the compiler feeds back to you using the same errors you've seen in non-macro Rust code. This means your IDE using LSP or the command line using cargo has the same rich errors Rust is famous for. I think this is a good way to think about macros. What do build tools do? They collect build artifacts like images and config. They change behavior of the app depending on configuration files. They bundle up loose files into more readily deployable blobs. And they rewrite source code from a form that is easier for the human, perhaps JSX or Sass, into a form that is easier for the machine, like JavaScript or CSS. Let's talk about how macros modify your source code. Macros, like unsafe code, are a little more difficult to read than normal Rust. But they're only used by very experienced crate and framework authors, not the end developer like me, who just wants to make my cool Tetris clone in WebAssembly. Note that the numerical result of 3 is not inserted into the code here. The addition must still be executed at runtime. It's the syntax that has been swapped around at compile time. This distinction between functions that execute at runtime and macros that execute at compile time is essential. Most languages have no access to compile time, and you are instead forced into building non-standard, error-prone tools that you run before executing your code as preprocessors. Let's look at a practical example of a Rust syntax macro. The CMD macro is from the command macros crate. You could have done this with a function, but then you'd be calling a function at runtime with the small overhead a function call incurs. You also would have needed commas in there. Note that the CMD macro introduces new syntax, not just an abstraction. Macros are an important part of Rust's zero-cost abstractions. Running them at compile time on the developer's machine allows new syntax to be added without waiting for a new edition of the language to be produced, clearly signposted and scoped inside the macro. You also don't need permission. Python finally has a case statement, but it took a long time to arrive, didn't it? The case for the case statement was officially put forward by Python's author Guido in 2006, right about the time I started writing Python. However, when he presented it at PyCon in 2007, the audience felt it was unnecessary, and so the proposal was rejected. This new syntax, even one that is functionally identical to nested if statements, was so hard to build that they took 15 years to agree to do it. In Rust, new syntax is a library. For example, here is a macro that looks like a native Rust match statement, but is actually creating routes in the hyper HTTP server. You can clearly see where the macro is on line 2 because of the bang at the end of match request. A common complaint from people who have never compiled Rust is that Rust's build times are slow. They are indeed a little slower than Go or Java, but that's because Rust is doing work for you. A lot more happens at Rust build time than in most other languages. Here, as I build the Rocket Web Framework's Hello World example in 10 seconds, 100 libraries compiled in total, many things happen in Rust that do not happen in other languages. Macros are being executed, arbitrary code is running, and macros themselves can insert further macros in your code, such as the printline macro, that will then require further expansion. The compiler, in conjunction with the rich type system, is proving that all code, both yours and imported libraries, does not break either your contracts or those built in to the language or libraries. And the borrow checker is exhaustively proving that no execution paths can break the memory guarantees of the language. These few extra seconds of build time equates to hours, days, weeks of gained productivity because you're not hunting bugs in log files. Oh, and the second and all subsequent times you build this, it takes no time at all. In previous videos, I've talked about how there's no Rust 2.0, and you see why that is now, don't you? There's no need to wait for a version 2 that may never arrive. You can write new language features today, and people have. Async, SERDI, contracts, proof systems, literals for list and maps, etc. The combination of low-level hardware access and high-level macros has given us the perfect language, not just now, but for the next 40 years. The Rust developers have built this incredible hybrid language. They didn't only make a complicated low-level language where you can do pointer arithmetic, nor did they just make a high-level language where you have no easy access to the underlying system, forcing you to write C to get at it. They gave us a language that has both. With Rust, it's turtles all the way down. If you'd like to see what you can write in Rust, click the top video. I used it to make a fun retro computer visualization for my sci-fi and mental health podcast, Lost Terminal. And if you'd like to watch more of my fast, technical videos, click the bottom video. Transcripts and markdown source code are available on GitHub, links in the description. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Hi friends, my name is Tris, and this is No Boilerplate, focusing on fast, technical videos. When I write Rust, I feel like a genius. I'll tell you why in a moment, but first, a simple question. Is this code correct? Well, it depends. If you or a colleague wanted to be totally sure this function could always work, you'd have to add lots of boilerplate code. You'd check the type of n, erroring if it wasn't a number. You'd make sure n wasn't so large so that it caused some kind of overflow. And what about negative numbers, or floating point numbers? Perhaps we'd ensure that n was passed by value, not by reference. Or that we'd captured the lock on the part of shared memory that n was in. Sure, most languages have sensible defaults for many of these. But do you have all of these rules and edge cases in your memory as you're writing code? All this uncertainty, and we just added one to a number. How can we hope to keep a whole language's assumptions all in our heads? We need a notation to concisely encapsulate all of this. Rust provides this notation in the rich type system. We'll look at it in a moment. As many of you know, Rust has topped the Stack Overflow developer survey for most loved language 6 years in a row. Compiler feedback is the secret to the satisfaction of writing Rust, I think. It makes me feel like a genius. My code works first time when I run it on production. Before I tell you why Rust makes you feel like a genius, let me show you how other languages make you feel stupid by forcing you into what I'll call error-driven development. The worst case is no errors. You run the code and it doesn't do what you want, but there are also no errors. You just have to sit there and imagine why on earth you can't get your error. Because JavaScript's certainly not going to tell you. Without annotations, even TypeScript can't help you either. Much better than no errors are bad errors. Let's look at how Python handles this. Not as well as you might think, it turns out. Python won't tell me exactly what's wrong here. It's only giving me some of the information. And this is typical with most languages. Sure, once you know what to look for, you can see that a list index is out of bounds. But there's so much missing here. Which list? What bound? Where even in line 2 is it? Errors in dynamically typed languages are usually bad. And it's not necessarily because the compiler authors didn't put in the work. They're doing the best they can. If you have a simple type system, the compiler simply can't catch many errors for you. By the way, it might look like Python has caught this error, but it actually didn't. Look again. This error happened at runtime. Your user has caught this error. If you're lucky, your tests might catch this error. Here's how it should be. Rust's errors are the nicest I've ever seen. Just look at it. We have the error itself, what the value should be, no more than 3, and what the value actually was, 6. We don't have to remember what the value is. The compiler has told us. Rust's errors happen at compile time, which is a fancy way of saying they must happen on the developer's machine, not on a server somewhere. Let's get a little deeper. Say I want to print out a number inside a loop for debugging purposes. But, whoops, like in C, numbers need a format string to be printed. Just look at this error message. Have you ever seen something so beautiful? It's not only telling us the error in plain language, but visually pointing to exactly where the problem is, and then suggests what we should do to fix it. I think this is why Rust has been voted the most loved language. The compiler is like a driving instructor, gently coaching you on how to navigate the dangerous highway. This is another simple example, but the Rust compiler holds your hand in this way right through async network programming, multiprocessing, and through channels and locks, and all of this is available to anyone via the macro system, so that third-party web libraries and frameworks have these rich errors too. The generous, kind, thoughtful Rust developers told us that it's dangerous out there. Take this. The Rust team set out to solve the most difficult problem we face in C, which is how to handle memories safely. They fixed it with the borrow checker, which I'll explain in a moment. Because they solved the most difficult problem the hard way, not cheating with a garbage collector or leaving it up to the developer, it was easy to use this solution to solve all the other problems by hooking into this new way of programming. If you make a compiler that understands your program's memory exhaustively, then you have made a compiler that understands your code exhaustively. And Rust isn't some theoretical language that is only used in universities or by esoteric wizards. All the components are already here today to make a language that stops you making mistakes and helps you if you break the rules. I have talked as long as I can without telling you about the borrow check. The good news is that it's extremely simple. It's the effects that are profound. The borrow checker has 2 rules. Data has 1 owner, and data may have multiple readers or 1 writer. That's it. Those are the 2 rules of the borrow checker. All behavior can be explained by these 2. You can think of data as a variable, though it's really the data that the variable points to. An example will make this clear. In Rust, you don't pass a variable into a function. You give ownership of the variable to that function. Here, when you've given name to the capitalized function, it's take this. The Rust team set forth the web libraries and frameworks have these rich errors too, via the macro system, so that third-party web libraries and frameworks have these readable to anyone multiprocessing and through channels and in this way right through async net. For the simple example, but the Rust compiler holds your hand in this way right through async network programming, multiprocessing, and through channels and locks, and all of this is available to anyone via the macro system, so that third-party web libraries and frameworks have these rich errors too. The generous, kind, thoughtful Rust developers told us that it's dangerous out there. Take this. The Rust team set out to solve the most difficult problem we face in C, which is how to handle memories safely. They fixed it with the borrow checker, which I'll explain in a moment. Because they solved the most difficult problem the hard way, not cheating with a garbage collector or leaving it up to the developer, it was easy to use this solution to solve all the other problems by hooking into this new way of programming. If you make a compiler that understands your program's memory exhaustively, then you have made a compiler that understands your code exhaustively. And Rust isn't some theoretical language that is only used in universities or by esoteric wizards. All the components are already here today to make a language that stops you making mistakes and helps you if you break the rules. I have talked as long as I can without telling you about the borrow checker. The good news is that it's extremely simple. It's the effects that are profound. The borrow checker has 2 rules. Data has 1 owner, and data may have multiple readers or 1 writer. That's it. Those are the 2 rules of the borrow checker. All behavior can be explained by these 2. You can think of data as a variable, though it's really the data that the variable points to. An example will make this clear. In Rust, you don't pass a variable into a function. You give ownership of the variable to that function. Here, when you've given name to the capitalized function, it's gone. Imagine we run a library. That sounds nice, doesn't it? At our library, we have essentially infinite copies of our books we can loan out. When we loan out our book, on lines 3 and 4, we are guaranteed a few things. The person who is borrowing our book is strictly forbidden from changing the text. They can only read the book until they give it back, after the loan function has finished. No doodling on the cover, and strictly no dog-earing the pages. That's just rude. If we, the library, remove the book from circulation, line 8, perhaps because the publisher has asked us to, we can no longer loan out the book. When passing a variable into a function, you are giving up ownership of the variable, i.e., it will be cleaned up when the function is done. In this example, we are the author of Neuromancer, William Gibson. Imagine that. It's 1983, and we have an unfinished manuscript, not a finished book. This typewritten first draft we want to get in front of our editor, for them to make changes, draw with their red pen all over it, and hand it back to us improved. We have only one manuscript. We could photocopy it, but then we'd have to reconcile multiple edits on paper. No thank you. We give Acebooks, our editor, a mutable borrow to our manuscript. They and only they can change it. They must give it back when they are done. We can't let it be mutably borrowed again. We have to wait for the first function, our editor, to return it. This is how ownership and borrowing work at a very low level. This system was designed to keep track of memory and to be able to free it when it is no longer used. But you can use this system to design much more complex invariants for your programs. Let's look at a practical, high-level example of the repercussions of this simple system. It's really nice that the Go team designed their language this way. It's the right way to handle shared memory. But they don't stop you sharing memory, which leads to problems. Rust's ownership made it easy to turn this recommendation into a compiler-checked rule. Now you understand ownership, I think you can read this. I have very high standards for it. Pause the video if you need to. We've created a list of users and sent it down a channel to some other thread or process or machine. After we've sent it, who knows what will happen to the data in there? It is unsafe to even read the user list after we've sent it. The borrow checker, despite being created to keep the memory safe, can be used trivially to create compile time check guaranteed safe channels. The thread receiving users could modify it as this first thread continues running, so the call to print vec could lead to a race condition, or, for that matter, a use after free bug. You don't even need to test this code to find these race conditions. The Rust compiler won't let you compile. In the Rust community, we call this fearless concurrency. In Rust, options are everywhere, because, as in life, you can't always get what you want. No one remembers all this. It's Byzantine and cruel. Your life doesn't have to be this way. Everyone agrees that nulls are bad until it's time to return nothing from a function. Wrapping a type in an option signifies clearly to the programmer, the IDE, and the compiler that this value might be something, or it might be nothing. It's not that it's 0 or an empty string, it might just be nothing. Nothing, the value, is useful, and the Rust compiler will force you to deal with it. Just as options transform nulls in Rust, results transform errors. In Rust, errors are values. You might have seen this in other languages like here in Go. Here, contains the error, and you must check it before accessing F. But there's nothing stopping you ignoring the error. In fact, this happens all the time. Rust captures this pattern in the result type so that the compiler can force you to handle the error. Nearly all of this that I've shown you doesn't exist at runtime. Your rich type hierarchy doesn't sneak onto your customer's laptop. The chain of optional functions resolving down nicely into a safe value with no errors doesn't run on your user's phone. Even the borrow checker writes itself out of the code as you compile it into your GPU-accelerated Doom clone running in WebAssembly. Rust's incredible richness and complexity only exists at compile time. After you have told the compiler how the world works by notating your code with all of this markup, the compiler exhaustively proves that nothing could violate the contracts that you have put into code. If everything checks out, all of this information is stripped out of the code as it is compiled into low-level assembly. Types don't exist at runtime. And this is actually the way the world works. We invented types. They're like a logical fiction. They only exist in our minds. CPUs don't know anything about types. They only know ones and zeros and a few operators. Both of these two code blocks compile down to exactly the same assembly. Your code can be both high level and faster in Rust than it could be if you had hand optimized it. Here is a non-exhaustive selection of some of the things the Rust compiler can validate for us for free. In my last video, I told you that in Rust, you tell the compiler how the world works, and it holds you accountable to this contract. The rich type system is how you write the contract. The compiler built on the borrow checker then holds you to it. This all means your code works perfectly the first time you deploy it and makes you feel like a genius. If you'd like to see what you can write in Rust, click the top video. I used it to make a fun retro computer visualization of my sci-fi and mental health podcast, Lost Terminal. And if you'd like to watch more of my fast technical videos, click the bottom video. Transcripts and markdown source code are available on GitHub, links in the description. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.
An ally has been slain.